So what is it about going out for food that can still be a part of the Jewish experience? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when Jews went to coffee houses, obviously they went to drink and often to eat something, but that maybe wasn't the most important thing. I mean, the food and drinks really fueled so many other things for them. And that doesn't mean that they were not particular about whether they liked it or not. But something that I found in my research is that very often people would say, oh, you know, I'm addicted to this coffee house and the coffee is terrible and the food is terrible. So why do you go there? Well, I go there because I like the activity, I like the feeling, I like the whole atmosphere around it, and that's how you get to the regulars and the habitués. So it's kind of it's an interesting balance there between, like, obviously if there wouldn't be any food and drinks, people would not go there, but on the other hand, it's very different from eating at home with your favorite kugel or favorite, you know, the way your grandma made it. So it's very different.
So do you think part of it is the performative aspect, being in public and performing the meal? Or does it have to do more with the ambience of the place that you're in and feeling as though you can enter into a world that is very different from the world you have in the home kitchen or dining room?
Well, I think that, I mean, one of the ways, you know, the Jews have used food outside the home as a way of defining themselves against the home in a way, to show that they're more than the people, you know, who live in the home and eat, you know, mother's cooking and things like that. And to, you know, they go outside the home and they eat, they go to, let's say, a cafe or to a Chinese restaurant. And this shows that they're, you know, sophisticated people who have, you know, who are open to the outside world and who are open to new foods and things like that. And also open to new ideas. Like the cafe became a place where, you know, the communists and anarchists and radicals got together to discuss topics. So it opens new horizons.
Well, I mean, let's also just talk about the Jewish deli for a second, right? Also known as the secular synagogue, as I've been taught. And so maybe eating outside of the home is a way to separate yourself from the home, but it also might be to create a feeling of home as in the cafes. So when you walk into the Jewish deli, you feel comfortable if you are on the inside of that culture. So when navigating a brave new world, also having a place outside of the home that feels a little bit more like home, where the smells remind you a little bit of being at home, or maybe a lot like being at home. And I know personally for myself that growing up in New York City, when I walk into the Jewish deli, I know just what to order, right? And there's something about that feeling of sitting down and saying, matzo ball soup, chopped liver, and a hot pastrami on rye, and really not even having to look at the menu, but looking for fun. But not having to look at the menu, that's also that feeling of home outside the home.
I just want to add that, you know, the answer to your first question really, I think, depends on geography and also chronology. You know, if we think about Eastern Europe in the 18th or 19th century, I don't think many people went to eat specific foods outside the house for Jewish food, right? But when we come to New York in, let's say, the 1940s and 50s, probably even before that, it's a whole different story. And even in the cafes and not just in the delis, in many different places, people are already enough removed from that world that wherever they go, they go outside, so you have this performative aspect, but then also it becomes a way, okay, if you came from Vienna, where's the Viennese style cafe in New York? If you came from Eastern Europe, the cafe itself will serve East European Jewish food, whatever that means. So something happens and changes when people are missing something that was there. We never know whether it's a real thing that was there or their recreation of that.
A nostalgic one, but that also speaks to Liz's point about going into a place where you can automatically feel at home. Mm-hmm. But then there's also the excitement of going into a place where you feel that you are the other, say the Chinese restaurant, but claiming that space as well. The part for me that remains somewhat problematic, at least in the earlier years of these cafes particularly, is that it was very much a male activity. There were certainly some women who felt that they could participate, but in many places they weren't welcome, and in many families they were not encouraged to be in public. And I wonder if you can all speak to the issue of gender and public dining.
Well, just with Chinese restaurants, and I think, and I think with other kinds of restaurants at that time, let's say between 1900 and 1920, a woman who went out to a restaurant alone was either a loose woman or she was like theatrical. And you really needed family-style dining to appear to allow women to go out to these restaurants, or you needed women's restaurants, kind of like tea shops and things like that, for women to be able to to go out to these restaurants alone or in pairs.
Yeah, I mean, in the coffee houses, there's a very clear history. From the very beginning, it was a homosocial space. It was a space for men. Women were there as servers, as cooks, as those people who prepare the coffee, sometimes even as owners, but never as a customer or somebody who participates in the activity. That starts to change as we move to the late 19th, early 20th century, but still, if you look at the Jewish context, most of the people who are these habitués of the cafes are men. You have very few women, people like Elze Lasker-Schiller or Anna Margolin or Leah Goldberg, but what's interesting about them is that they are unique. They find a cafe of their own, right? And then they write about it, and it's very important, but it's very clear that it's a word of men, and it's also clear that for these Jewish men who had religious education, they experienced the coffee house as a modern secular substitute to the house of study. It's exactly the same thing. There was a homosocial space where people argued about Talmud, and now they argue about a poem or a novel.
Was there resistance against women coming into them?
It's exactly the same thing. When you see a woman sitting on her own, like Leah Goldberg, many people who didn't know who she is, that she's a famous poet, thought that she's a loose woman. So yeah, there was a lot of resistance about that, and it's paradoxical because one of the most important things about coffee houses is that it's open to everybody. It's democratic, right? You only need, it's Penny University. You only need to buy a cup of coffee and it's open to everybody, but it's not.
Well, and this became a problem for Jewish women at that time, in the early 20th century, because they were the young ones they'd born in the United States and they were going to work. They weren't tied to the stove like their mothers. So they had jobs and they needed to eat lunch somewheres. So they had to go out, and so they didn't find a comfortable place, perhaps in more traditional restaurants. So they started going out to sort of coffee shops and places like sort of American-style coffee shops or soda fountains where you could get a quick meal.
Speaking of soda shops, can you talk a little bit about the egg cream? It is so Jewish and so New York. Or are you not prepared
No,
to?
I can talk about egg cream. It's a big topic with a lot of fizz in it. Egg creams, I think, are what I would say are strictly from hunger. In New York, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a huge soda fountain culture. And people, made these incredible concoctions of ice cream and syrup and seltzer water, and they were very over the top. But a lot of Jews on the Lower East Side were poor and couldn't afford, like an ice cream sundae. And so what was developed was a dish something called the egg cream, which famously had neither egg nor cream in it.
That's what I love about it.
And it only cost 5 cents. So it was very, very affordable, and it gave you, it gave you the fizz from the seltzer water going up into your nose, and there was milk in it, so it had the creaminess, and of course it had the chocolate flavor from the syrup. And so this was an inexpensive substitute for a much fancier thing, and it became a defining dish or drink for people who grew up on the Lower East Side. They were people who drank egg creams. And they became aficionados of egg creams, and the nostalgia for egg creams continues today.
There's something about soda and Jews that I don't think people did enough research, because we focus on New York, but if you think about Tel Aviv, the East European Jews who built Tel Aviv and lived in Tel Aviv, it was known universally in the 30s and 40s as the city of gazos. People said Tel Aviv doesn't manufacture anything but gazos and soda. That was the Hebrew name for soda drinks. So why is it? I don't know, but it's really interesting that as different culture and different context as New York and Tel Aviv has this commonality with the soda.
And Andy, you can speak to the 1920s and seltzer in the United States and the mobs.
But I think that, one of the commonalities of Tel Aviv and New York is, the Ashkenazi Jewish food. It's a little heavy.
Right.
And so you need the Grapsfutter in order to, recover from the meal. You need to have some, to drink the seltzer water, get some carbonation, and have a comfortable belch afterward in order to feel comfortable.
Right.
But weren't mobsters involved in the seltzer wars in the 1920s?
Yes. There were Jewish gangsters who wanted to take over not only seltzer, but things like kosher poultry, and also soda fountain syrup. Because at that time there were dozens and dozens of seltzer makers in New York, dozens and dozens of soda fountain syrup makers, lots of little mom and pop stores, and they were vulnerable. And the gangsters saw them as easy prey and tried to control them and build monopolies. Rockefeller had the Standard Oil monopoly. They wanted to become the seltzer water kings of New York.
Wow.
Well, can you speak to the role of these eating establishments, or drinking establishments, whether it's cafe or Chinese restaurant or deli, as a means of either or both upward mobility and assimilation? Because I think that it's a very important step to go outside of the home, not just to breach the divide between the Jewish home and the external environment, but also to try and better oneself.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is just at the Jewish deli, eating these ginormous sandwiches filled with meat, which was just not something one ever would have done in Eastern Europe or been able to do in Eastern Europe. Meat was just not going to be that plentiful on your plate. So one of the signs of being comfortable in the United States was being able to eat a lot more meat. And so that's just the simplest example for me, as being able to go out and get a meat sandwich that's this tall.
And
that
you're still doing it.
just screams upward mobility. Now I only have half.
Oh, okay.
Well, Chinese restaurants were definitely for defining yourselves, as somebody who's part of American life, because they were, where sophisticated people ate in the early 20th century, where the sort of intellectuals ate and the kind of bohemians ate, and of course they served pork. And if you wanted to define yourselves as not like old world, not like your parents, the one thing that you did was eat pork. Or one thing that you could do was eat pork. So, and then they had various, and then of course, then kosher restaurateurs started serving chop suey, and it became a lot more muddled. But Chinese food was definitely a sign of that you were sophisticated, and not just like somebody from the shtetl.
If you step a little bit outside New York and look at it globally, I think it's safe to say that coffee houses were really places where one of the very few places where Jews and non-Jews could be together. It didn't happen in taverns and clubs, just not because Jews didn't like to drink alcohol, but it just didn't happen. Jews were not welcome and they didn't feel comfortable, and in coffee house they could. So it really had a very important role in acculturation and assimilation. Now, when you talk about the economic aspect and what does it mean to go out, of course, going to coffee house, unlike restaurants, you don't need a lot. You buy 1 cup of coffee, but even that was too much for a lot of people who had to borrow money in order to buy a cup of coffee. And something that I never thought about at the beginning, but then became clear, you need to dress up. People did not go like today, you know, with trainings to the coffee house. And in Warsaw, for example, poor Jews didn't have the money for a cup of coffee and definitely didn't have the clothes to go to the fashionable places like Cafe Ziemianska. So they didn't.
So we've touched on a lot of interesting things, but one thing we haven't mentioned yet are the dairy restaurants. And I wonder if you could speak to them.
I feel sad when I think about dairy restaurants because that genre all but doesn't exist anymore. And of course, the dairy restaurants that were in New York City, but all over North America, were we always refer to them as the anti-delis, right? Because if you were kosher at the deli, you ate meat, and then there was this other place you could go out, which was the dairy restaurant. And that was, you know, that you would not find meat there, but you would find blintzes filled with cheese. You would find a borscht that had sour cream in it. And so for me, I love those foods. I love those dairy foods. And as kosher became less and less relevant, we see less and less dairy restaurants as necessities. And you see a lot of those dairy foods today being served in a deli. Those genres kind of combined at a certain point.
So I think the first thing when we think about the dairy restaurant, we think obviously about kashrus and about what is kosher and what is not, and the necessity for Jews to separate and to have a dairy restaurant as opposed to the deli or the meat places. But I think we also have to remember that in the Polish context, not the Jewish Polish, the Polish context, what we call cafe was often what the Polish call melenczelnia, which is a milk bar, you know? So it's not just about kashrut. And then I think if you look at the Lower East Side, many of these places that were called cafes, they really served dairy food. And again, people assumed that's because of kosher reasons. But not always. Sometimes it's because they borrow it from the Polish landscape. So like everything else with Jewish food, it's hard to tell what is Jewish and what is just borrowing from what is around and really adapting it to the Jewish needs.